Part 1, The Fateful Encounter. Amara walked along the familiar path from school to her home. It was an autumn afternoon, with a crisp chill in the air and a faint scent of jasmine wafting through the breeze. The 12-year-old girl had known this route all her life. The small, cozy houses, the tree-lined streets, and the little shops along the way painted a picture of a simple yet warm neighborhood, but today, something felt different. As she approached the corner of the street, Amara heard a faint noise, almost like a whimper. She stopped, listening more intently, and realized the sound was coming from a bush by the side of the road. Carefully, she walked closer, parted the leaves, and discovered a small dog, trembling with fear. The dog was clearly lost. Its fur was matted with dirt, and its eyes were wide with a mix of fear and hope. Amara's heart went out to the little creature. She knew what it felt like to be scared and alone. Without thinking twice, she reached out a hand. The dog sniffed her cautiously but didn't shy away. "Hey, little one," she whispered softly, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "Are you lost?" The dog wagged its tail weakly, as if sensing her kindness. Amara took off her backpack, searching for the half-eaten sandwich she saved from lunch. She tore a small piece and offered it to the dog, who devoured it hungrily. "You must be really hungry," she said with a smile. After a few moments, she decided to pick up the dog. It didn't resist, instead snuggling into her arms, as if grateful for the warmth and comfort. As she walked home, Amara couldn't help but think about how this little dog ended up here, lost and afraid. She wondered if someone was out there looking for it or if it had been abandoned. She knew she couldn't leave it out here alone, especially with the night drawing in and the temperature dropping. Part 2, A Twist of Fate. When she arrived home, Amara's mother, Denise, was already in the kitchen preparing dinner. She raised an eyebrow as she saw her daughter walk in with a scruffy little dog in her arms. "Amara, what's this?" her mother asked, wiping her hands on a towel. "I found him on the way back from school, Mom. He looked so scared and hungry. Can we keep him, just for tonight? Until we find his owner?" Amara pleaded. Denise sighed, but she saw the earnest look in her daughter's eyes. She had always taught Amara to be kind and caring, especially towards those who couldn't fend for themselves. And this little dog looked like it needed help. "All right, but just for tonight," Denise agreed. "We'll see if anyone's looking for him tomorrow." That night, Amara made a little bed for the dog with some old blankets. She named him Buddy because he seemed like he could use a friend. As she lay in bed, she felt a strange sense of excitement. She couldn't help but feel like this was the beginning of something unusual, something that would change her life. The next day, Amara and Denise made posters with Buddy's picture, and Amara posted about him on social media, hoping to find his owner. It wasn't long before they received a response, but not the kind Amara expected. A message came through from a woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who claimed to recognize the dog. Mrs. Whitfield requested to meet Amara in person and thanked her profusely for finding her special dog. She asked if Amara could bring Buddy to her home, an address that Amara quickly realized belonged to one of the largest mansions in town. "Mom, look at this," Amara showed the message to Denise. "She wants us to bring Buddy to her house. But why all the fuss? Do you think it's safe?" Denise pondered for a moment. "Well, we can go together. It might be interesting to find out why this dog is so special." Part 3, An Unexpected Invitation. The next day, they arrived at the grand mansion. It was unlike any house Amara had ever seen up close. The tall iron gates opened slowly, revealing a long driveway lined with ancient oaks. At the end stood the mansion, a towering structure with elegant stonework and massive windows. Amara felt a mix of awe and apprehension as they approached the front door. A butler greeted them, his face stoic but polite, and led them through a grand foyer into a luxurious sitting room where Mrs. Whitfield awaited. She was a dignified woman in her 60s, with silver hair neatly pinned up and a warm but calculating gaze. "Thank you so much for bringing Buddy back to us," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice smooth and refined. "You've done us a great service." Amara and Denise exchanged curious glances. There was something peculiar in her tone, something that suggested there was more to this story. "Buddy is very special to us," Mrs. Whitfield continued, "and not just because he's our pet. He belonged to my late husband, who passed away last year. He always said Buddy had a gift, a way of bringing the right people into our lives." Denise raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Whitfield leaned forward slightly, her eyes twinkling with an almost mysterious energy. I believe you finding Buddy was no accident. I'd like to invite you both to stay here for the weekend. There's something I'd like to show you, something I think you'll find quite unbelievable. Amara's heart raced. She looked at her mother, who seemed just as intrigued as she was. This was definitely not what they expected from returning a lost dog. Why was this woman so interested in them? What could she possibly want to show them? Will you accept my invitation? Mrs. Whitfield asked, her eyes locked onto Amara's with a penetrating intensity. Amara nodded slowly. She didn't know what awaited them, but she couldn't deny the sense of curiosity burning inside her. Good, Mrs. Whitfield said, smiling. I promise you, this will be a weekend you'll never forget. Chapter 4, The Secrets of Whitfield Mansion. That evening, Amara and Denise were shown to their rooms, which were as luxurious as the rest of the mansion, complete with antique furniture, elegant drapes, and soft, warm beds. Despite the grandeur, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something peculiar about the place. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the mansion was hiding secrets behind its beautiful facade. Amara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. Why had Mrs. Whitfield invited them here? What did she mean by saying Buddy had a way of bringing the right people into their lives? She decided she needed to explore. Slipping out of bed, Amara tiptoed to the door and slowly opened it. The hallway was dimly lit, with shadows dancing along the walls. She could hear the faint ticking of a grandfather clock echoing through the corridors. She made her way quietly down the hall, her heart beating fast in her chest. As she rounded a corner, she heard voices, Mrs. Whitfield and someone else. She pressed herself against the wall and listened. Are you sure about this, Eleanor? A deep male voice asked. The girl is just a child. Yes, I'm sure, Mrs. Whitfield replied firmly. She found Buddy for a reason. She has a role to play here, and it's time she learns the truth. Amara's curiosity piqued even more. She had to find out what they were talking about. She crept closer, her breath held, trying to get a better look. She saw Mrs. Whitfield standing with a tall man in a long coat. They were looking at a portrait on the wall, a portrait of a man who looked remarkably like the man standing beside her. We must proceed carefully, the man said. If she's the one, we cannot risk scaring her away. Amara accidentally brushed against a vase on a small table, causing it to wobble. She caught it just in time, but it made enough noise to draw their attention. Who's there? Mrs. Whitfield called out, her voice sharp. Amara froze, her heart pounding. She considered running back to her room but knew it was too late. Stepping into the dim light, she revealed herself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, Amara said, her voice trembling slightly. I just couldn't sleep, and I was curious. Mrs. Whitfield's stern expression softened. It's all right, dear. Come, we need to talk. Chapter 5, The Revelation. Amara followed Mrs. Whitfield and the mysterious man into a small study filled with bookshelves and a large oak desk. Mrs. Whitfield gestured for her to sit down. I think it's time we tell you why you're really here, Mrs. Whitfield began. This is Mr. Hawthorne, a close family friend. And that, she pointed to the portrait, is my late husband, Edward Whitfield. Amara nodded, unsure where this was leading. Edward wasn't just a wealthy businessman, Mrs. Whitfield continued. He was part of a very old society, the Guardians of the Veil. It's a group dedicated to protecting something very ancient and powerful, something that could change the world for better or for worse. Buddy was Edward's companion, and he believed the dog had a unique gift, an ability to sense people who are destined to play a significant role in our cause. Amara listened, her eyes wide. You mean, like magic? Not exactly, Mr. Hawthorne replied. It's more like an intuition, a deeper understanding of the connections between people and events. When Buddy led you to us, Mrs. Whitfield added, I knew there was something special about you. And now that you're here, I'd like to see if you're willing to learn more, about yourself and about the role you might play. Amara felt a mix of excitement and fear. This was all so much to take in. She had always felt a bit different, a bit out of place in her normal life. Could this be why? What would I have to do? Amara asked cautiously. Just be yourself, Mrs. Whitfield said with a reassuring smile. Stay with us, learn, and see if this path feels right for you. There's no pressure, Amara. Only an invitation to discover. Chapter 6, The Test. Over the next few days, Amara explored the mansion and the surrounding grounds with Buddy always by her side. She was introduced to various members of the Guardians of the Veil, each with their own unique talents and stories. She learned about ancient artifacts, symbols, and texts that hinted at hidden knowledge and powers, but there was also a test, a series of challenges designed to measure her intuition, courage, and heart. One day, she found herself standing before an old, ornate mirror in a secluded room at the end of a long hallway. Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne were with her. "This is the mirror of reflections," Mrs. Whitfield explained. "It shows not just what you are, but who you are deep down. It can reveal your strengths, your fears, and your true potential." Amara gazed into the mirror, and at first, she only saw her own reflection, her curly black hair, her brown eyes wide with anticipation. But then the image began to change. She saw herself standing on a mountaintop, facing a fierce storm. She saw herself helping a friend in need, showing kindness and bravery. She saw her fears, being alone, losing those she loved, but she also saw herself facing them head-on. When the images faded, Amara felt a strange sense of peace. She turned to Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne. "I think I understand now. It's not about having special powers. It's about being true to yourself and being ready to help when the time comes." Mr. Hawthorne nodded. "Exactly, Amara. And you've shown us that you're ready." Chapter 7, The Unseen Threat. However, not everything was as serene as it seemed. Amara began to notice strange occurrences, shadows that moved on their own, whispered voices that seemed to come from nowhere. She soon learned that not everyone welcomed her presence. There were factions within the Guardians who believed that bringing in a young girl with no formal training was a mistake. One evening, Amara overheard a heated argument between Mrs. Whitfield and another member, a stern woman named Margot. "She's too young and inexperienced," Margot hissed. "We're risking everything by letting her stay." "She has the potential," Mrs. Whitfield replied calmly. "And more importantly, she has the heart. That's what Edward believed in, and that's what I believe in." "But if she's not the right one," Margot's voice trailed off, filled with an ominous tone. Amara knew she had to prove herself not just to Mrs. Whitfield, but to everyone. She threw herself into her lessons, learning about the history of the Guardians, the significance of their artifacts, and the hidden dangers they protected the world from. Chapter 8, The Final Challenge. A week after her arrival, Amara was summoned to the Grand Hall. Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Hawthorne, and all the members of the Guardians were gathered. Buddy stood beside her, his tail wagging softly, as if he knew what was about to happen. "Today is a special day," Mrs. Whitfield announced. "Today, Amara will face her final challenge. If she succeeds, she will be welcomed as one of us." Amara felt a surge of determination. She had come this far and wasn't going to back down now. The challenge was a test of courage and intuition. She was led to an underground chamber beneath the mansion, where she had to retrieve an ancient relic from a maze filled with illusions and traps. She had to rely on her instincts, the lessons she had learned, and most importantly, her bond with Buddy. As she navigated the maze, she faced terrifying visions, her mother in danger, her friends turning away from her. But she reminded herself they were just illusions. Buddy barked, guiding her with his keen sense, and together they made their way to the relic, a small, glowing orb. Holding the orb in her hands, Amara felt a rush of energy, a connection to something much larger than herself. She knew now that she was meant to be here. Chapter 9, A New Beginning. When Amara emerged from the maze, the Guardians erupted in applause. Mrs. Whitfield embraced her, her eyes filled with pride. "You did it, Amara," she said. "You've proven yourself in every way." Margot, too, stepped forward, a reluctant but genuine smile on her face. "I may have doubted you, but you've shown more courage than many of us. Welcome to the Guardians of the Veil." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had found her place, her purpose. She wasn't just a girl who found a lost dog anymore, she was part of something bigger, something meaningful. That night, as she lay in her bed in the mansion, Buddy curled up next to her, Amara knew her life would never be the same. She had found more than just a new adventure, she had found a new family, a new destiny. Chapter 10, Shadows from the Past. The days after Amara's induction into the Guardians of the Veil were filled with intense training, not just in understanding the artifacts and lore but also in physical and mental endurance. The mansion seemed even larger now, each room holding new secrets, new lessons. Amara spent hours with Mr. Hawthorne, learning about the history of the Guardians, how they had protected the world from unseen dangers for centuries, always in the shadows, always unknown to the general populace, but with each lesson came new questions. One day, while studying an ancient book in the library, Amara came across a passage about the lost ones, former guardians who had turned against the order. She was drawn to a particular name, Cedric Hawthorne. She realized with a jolt that the traitor shared a last name with Mr. Hawthorne. Curiosity got the better of her. Later that evening, after dinner, she approached Mr. Hawthorne. "Who was Cedric Hawthorne?" she asked hesitantly. Amara. Hawthorne's face darkened, his usually calm demeanor wavering for a moment. "Cedric was my brother," he finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "He was once a guardian, like me. But he sought power over purpose. He believed the artifacts could be used to control rather than protect. When the council rejected his ideas, he turned his back on us. We haven't heard from him in years, but we believe he's still out there, gathering others to his cause." The revelation sent a chill down Amara's spine. The idea that someone with such knowledge and power could be out there, planning something against the Guardians, filled her with unease. "Why didn't you tell me about him before?" she asked. "Because I wanted you to know the Guardians for what we are, not for the mistakes of our past," Mr. Hawthorne replied. "But I suppose you have a right to know now. Be vigilant, Amara. Not all threats come from outside." The warning lingered with Amara, a constant reminder that she was part of something much bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Chapter 11, The Hidden Chamber. One stormy night, about 2 weeks after learning about Cedric, Amara woke up to Buddy barking furiously. She had never seen him so agitated. He paced around her room, growling and barking at something beyond the door. She got up and opened the door to see what was wrong, and Buddy bolted out into the dark hallway. "Buddy, wait!" Amara called, rushing after him. The hallways were dim, lit only by flashes of lightning from outside. Buddy led her down a series of corridors she hadn't explored much before, finally stopping in front of a large, weathered door that looked older than the rest of the mansion. Amara pushed the door open and stepped into a dark room. She could barely see anything until another flash of lightning illuminated the space, revealing it to be an ancient, hidden chamber. Dust covered the floor, and old relics and artifacts were strewn about haphazardly. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested an old, tattered journal. She approached cautiously, sensing that this room had not been touched in a very long time. The journal was bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age. As she opened it, she noticed the handwriting was sharp and hurried, as if the writer was desperate to record their thoughts. She soon realized that it was Cedric Hawthorne's journal. In it, Cedric wrote about his growing frustration with the Guardians, his belief that they were wasting their potential. He spoke of powerful beings he had encountered, spirits and entities that promised him power in exchange for loyalty. But one entry stood out: "The girl is the key. The prophecy speaks of a child who will unlock the true power of the veil. I must find her before the Guardians do. She will be my victory and their downfall." Amara's breath caught in her throat. Was Cedric talking about her? She suddenly felt exposed, like the shadows in the room were watching her, waiting. She knew she had to show this to Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne immediately. As she turned to leave, she heard a creaking sound behind her. She spun around and saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. For a moment, she thought it might be Cedric himself, but as the figure stepped into the dim light, she saw it was Margot. "What are you doing here?" Margot's voice was cold, suspicious. Amara hid the journal behind her back. "I heard Buddy barking. He led me here." Margot's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Amara thought she might take the journal by force. But then Margot's gaze softened. "Be careful, Amara. You're stepping into dangerous territory. You shouldn't trust everything you read, or everyone you think is on your side." Amara didn't know what to make of that. Was Margot warning her about Cedric, or was there something more she wasn't saying? Chapter 12, An Unseen Alliance. Back in her room, Amara couldn't sleep. She kept reading Cedric's journal, trying to piece together his plans. It became clear that Cedric was forming an alliance with dark forces, entities that existed beyond the veil. These beings craved chaos and would grant power to those who aided them. Cedric believed the key to unlocking their full potential lay in a child with a pure heart but a strong will. The next morning, Amara took the journal to Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne. They read it with grave expressions. "This is worse than I feared," Mrs. Whitfield said. Cedric has gone further than we imagined. If he truly believes you are the key, then you're in more danger than any of us realized. We must prepare for his return, Mr. Hawthorne added. And we need to find out who else he might have recruited. He's always been persuasive. He could have allies within our own ranks. Amara suddenly remembered Margot's words from the night before. What if he's already here, she asked. Margot said something strange to me last night. It almost sounded like a warning. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. Margot has always been skeptical, but she's loyal. Still, we can't rule anything out. We need to be vigilant. Chapter 13, The gathering storm. In the days that followed, tensions within the mansion grew. There were whispered conversations, suspicious glances, and a general sense of unease. Amara continued her training, but now there was an added sense of urgency. Every lesson, every piece of knowledge could be vital. One evening, as the guardians gathered for a meeting, the air was thick with anticipation. Mrs. Whitfield stood at the head of the table, her expression serious. We have reason to believe that Cedric Hawthorne is planning an attack, she began. And we suspect he may have sympathizers among us. We must be prepared for anything. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room. A deep, resonant voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. You're too late, Eleanor. The time of the guardians is over. The age of the veil is upon us. Everyone looked around, alarmed. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. She recognized the voice from Cedric's journal. It was one of the dark entities. The room descended into chaos. Guardians drew their weapons, and protective wards were activated. Amara could see shadows moving along the walls, twisting and writhing as if alive. She knew Cedric's forces were making their move. Chapter 14, Betrayal and Revelation. Amara stayed close to Buddy as chaos erupted around them. She could see guardians fighting against dark, spectral figures, their weapons clashing against invisible foes. She had trained for this, but the reality was far more terrifying than she had imagined. Amidst the chaos, Margot suddenly appeared beside her. Come with me, Amara. We need to get you to safety, she urged, her eyes darting around. Amara hesitated. She remembered the warning about not trusting everyone. How do I know I can trust you? She asked. Margot's expression hardened, and for a moment, Amara saw something dark flash in her eyes. You don't have a choice, Margot snapped and grabbed her arm, pulling her through a side door. As they moved through the winding corridors, Amara realized they were heading deeper into the mansion. Margot's grip was tight and unyielding, and a sense of dread filled Amara's heart. They finally stopped in front of an old wooden door. Inside, Margot commanded. Amara stepped in and immediately realized it was a trap. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center and strange symbols drawn on the floor. Before she could react, Margot pushed her into the room and slammed the door shut. Amara heard the lock click from the outside. Why are you doing this? Amara shouted, pounding on the door. I'm doing what's necessary. Margot's voice came through the door, sounding almost regretful. I've seen what Cedric can offer, and it's far more than what the Guardians ever did. I'm sorry, Amara. But you're too important for me to let you go. Chapter 15, The Escape. Amara's mind raced. She was trapped, but she wasn't helpless. She took a deep breath and remembered her training. She knew that the symbols on the floor were a binding spell, designed to keep her in one place. She looked around for anything she could use to break it. Buddy, who had followed them unnoticed, nudged her leg and whimpered. She realized he might be the key. Buddy, can you fetch something? Anything sharp, she whispered. Buddy darted around the room and came back with a jagged piece of wood. Amara took it and carefully scraped away at one of the symbols. She knew she didn't have much time before Margot or someone else returned. As she finished disrupting the symbol, she felt a sudden release, like a weight lifting off her shoulders. The spell was broken. She ran to the door and tried to force it open, but it was too strong. She needed another way out. There was a small window high up on the wall. It was a tight fit, but she was small and agile. She climbed up, with Buddy following close behind, and squeezed through. They landed in a garden outside. Just as she heard footsteps approaching the door she had been locked behind, Amara knew she needed to get back to the others and warn them about Margot's betrayal. She sprinted across the grounds, Buddy keeping pace beside her, his ears perked up and alert. Chapter 16, The Battle Within. As she neared the mansion's main hall, Amara saw the battle was still raging. She spotted Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne fighting side by side, fending off dark figures that seemed to materialize out of the shadows. Mrs. Whitfield. Amara shouted. Margot is a traitor. She tried to lock me away. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes widened, and she nodded, shouting back, stay close, Amara. We have to protect the Heart of the Veil. Amara had heard of the Heart of the Veil before, an artifact said to be the source of the Guardian's power, hidden deep within the mansion. If Cedric's forces got to it, all would be lost. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the battle, a tall man with a striking resemblance to Mr. Hawthorne. Cedric. His eyes glowed with a dark energy, and a cruel smile spread across his face. Brother, Cedric called out mockingly. You've chosen the losing side. Mr. Hawthorne stepped forward, his face set with determination. It's not too late, Cedric. You can still turn back. Cedric laughed, a cold, hollow sound. No, I've seen the truth, and soon everyone will. The age of the Guardians is over. He raised his hand, and a wave of dark energy surged forward. Mr. Hawthorne countered with a barrier, but it was clear that Cedric's power had grown immensely. Amara knew she had to do something. She felt the weight of the journal in her bag, the answers had to be there. As she quickly flipped through its pages, she found a passage about the Heart of the Veil. Only one with a pure heart and strong will can wield the heart and command its power, it read. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 17, The Heart of the Veil. Amara ran toward the chamber where the Heart of the Veil was kept. She could feel Cedric's dark energy pulling at her, trying to stop her, but she pushed forward. She reached the chamber doors, which were guarded by 2 loyal guardians. They nodded, letting her pass, knowing she was their last hope. Inside, the Heart of the Veil glowed with a soft, pulsing light. It was a beautiful crystal, suspended in mid-air, surrounded by ancient symbols. Amara could feel its energy resonating with her, like a distant melody calling her name. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the crystal. A surge of warmth spread through her body, and she felt a rush of memories, emotions, and knowledge flow into her mind. She saw visions of past guardians, of battles fought and won, of sacrifices made. She understood now. The power of the veil wasn't about control, it was about harmony. It was about protecting the balance between light and dark, life and death. With renewed strength, she turned and headed back to the battle. She could see Cedric and Mr. Hawthorne still locked in a fierce struggle. Cedric's dark forces were gaining ground, but Amara knew she had the key to turning the tide. She raised the Heart of the Veil and focused, channeling all her courage, all her willpower into it. A blinding light erupted from the crystal, cutting through the darkness, driving back the shadowy figures. Cedric screamed, his power faltering. No. This isn't possible, he shouted, but Amara knew it was. She pushed forward, the light intensifying, until it engulfed Cedric completely. The dark figures vanished, and Cedric fell to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief. It's over, Cedric, Amara said softly. The power you sought was never meant to be wielded like this. Cedric looked up, his face filled with a mix of rage and regret. You have no idea what you've done. With that, he vanished, leaving only a faint whisper on the wind. Chapter 18, A New Dawn. The battle was over. The guardians slowly gathered around, their faces filled with relief and exhaustion. Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne approached Amara, their expressions a mix of pride and gratitude. You did it, Amara, Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice choked with emotion. You saved us all. Mr. Hawthorne nodded. You've proven yourself to be one of the greatest guardians of the veil. We are honored to have you with us. Amara smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging. She looked around at the faces of the guardians, her new family, and knew she had found her place in the world. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, she felt a sense of hope and possibility. This was just the beginning of her journey. With Buddy by her side, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 19, The Return of the Lost. The weeks following the battle at Whitfield Mansion were both a time of rebuilding and preparation. While Cedric had been defeated and his dark forces dispersed, the Guardians knew that his threat had not vanished completely. Rumors spread quickly among the members that Cedric was still out there, licking his wounds and plotting his return. Amara, now a full-fledged Guardian, continued her training but with a new sense of urgency. She had seen what was possible when the forces of darkness converged, and she had felt the weight of being the one to stand against them. She knew she had to be ready for whatever came next. One afternoon, while studying in the grand library, she came across an old, dusty book tucked away on the highest shelf. It was bound in dark leather and had no title on its spine. Amara's curiosity got the better of her. She pulled it down and carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with strange symbols and writings in a language she couldn't quite decipher, but one page stood out. It was a map, an ancient-looking one with markings and symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint glow. Amara traced her fingers along the paths on the map, feeling an odd pull, like something, or someone, was calling her. She knew she had to show this to Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne. When she brought it to them, their faces went pale. "This is a map of the lost sanctuary," Mr. Hawthorne said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a place we believe to be a myth, a sanctuary where the guardians of the veil would retreat in times of great peril." Mrs. Whitfield looked grave. "It's also said to be where Cedric first began his descent into darkness. If he's planning to return, this might be where he goes to regain his strength." Amara felt a chill run down her spine. "So, we have to go there," she said. "We have to find out what he's planning and stop him before he can attack again." Mrs. Whitfield nodded slowly. "Yes, but it's dangerous. If you go, you must be prepared for anything." Chapter 20. The Journey to the Lost Sanctuary. Amara was not alone on this journey. Mr. Hawthorne insisted on accompanying her, along with two other skilled guardians, Helena and Tobias. They were both seasoned members of the order, Helena, a master of defensive spells, and Tobias, known for his ability to see through illusions. The group prepared meticulously, gathering supplies, studying the map, and planning their route. Amara could feel the weight of the task ahead, but she also felt a strange sense of excitement. This was her first real mission as a guardian, and she knew it was critical. As they set off, the terrain grew increasingly treacherous. The map led them through dense forests, across rivers, and up steep mountains. The path was winding and often seemed to shift beneath their feet, as if the landscape itself was trying to turn them around. At night, they camped under the stars, taking turns keeping watch. During her watch one night, Amara felt a presence nearby, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. She stood up, holding her breath, but when she reached out with her senses, she felt nothing. Buddy, who was always by her side, seemed uneasy too. His ears perked up and his eyes focused on the darkness. "We're being watched," she whispered to Buddy, who gave a low growl in response, but when morning came, the feeling had passed and they continued their journey. Chapter 21. The first encounter. After a week of travel, they finally reached the entrance to the lost sanctuary, a massive, ancient gate carved into the side of a mountain. The stonework was covered in moss, and vines draped over the archway. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier, as if it were charged with an unseen energy. "Be on your guard," Mr. Hawthorne warned. "This place is filled with traps and illusions designed to keep intruders out." As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the light from outside seemed to fade away, swallowed by the darkness. Amara felt a shiver run down her spine. She could hear faint whispers echoing through the corridors, voices she couldn't quite make out. They moved cautiously, their steps echoing off the stone walls. Suddenly, the ground beneath Amara gave way, and she felt herself falling. She landed on a hard surface below with a thud. She looked around and realized she was separated from the group. She called out, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. "Amara." Mr. Hawthorne's voice came from above. "Hold on, we'll find a way down to you." Amara looked around. She was in a small chamber with no obvious exits. She knew she couldn't just wait. She had to find a way out. She held the heart of the veil close, feeling its warmth radiate through her. She closed her eyes and focused, reaching out with her senses. Suddenly, she felt a tug, a pull towards the wall. She moved closer and noticed a faint outline of a door. She pushed against it, and the wall shifted, revealing a hidden passageway. Buddy barked, as if to say, "Good job," and they pressed forward. Chapter 22. The Trials of the Sanctuary. The hidden passage led them deeper into the sanctuary. As Amara moved through the narrow corridor, she could feel the temperature drop further. The walls seemed to close in around her, and she had to remind herself to breathe, to stay calm. She entered another chamber, this one filled with mirrors. But these weren't ordinary mirrors. As she looked into them, she saw different versions of herself, some older, some younger, some wearing expressions of fear, others of anger. One mirror, in particular, caught her eye. In it, she saw herself standing beside Cedric, her eyes glowing with the same dark energy she had seen in his. She recoiled, feeling a surge of fear. Is this who I could become? She whispered to herself. But then she remembered the heart of the veil and the lessons she had learned. She reached out, touching the mirror, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The room shifted again, and the other mirrors vanished. She knew she was on the right path, but the trials were far from over. As she continued, she faced more challenges, illusions that tried to trick her, voices that tried to manipulate her. But with each test, she felt herself growing stronger, more sure of who she was and what she stood for. Finally, after what felt like hours, she emerged into a vast chamber lit by a dim, eerie glow. In the center, she saw Cedric, kneeling before a dark altar. Around him stood several shadowy figures, all watching him intently. Chapter 23, Confronting the Darkness. Cedric looked up as Amara entered, his eyes narrowing with surprise and then amusement. "So, you made it through," he said, standing. "I knew you were special, but I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to come here alone." "I'm not alone," Amara replied, holding up the heart of the veil. "And I'm not here to join you. I'm here to stop you." Cedric laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Stop me? You have no idea what you're up against. This power," he gestured to the dark altar, "is beyond anything the Guardians could ever offer. You could join me, Amara. Together, we could reshape the world." Amara felt the pull of his words, the temptation of power. But she remembered the lessons she had learned, the visions she had seen in the mirror chamber. She knew that power without purpose was a path to destruction. "No, Cedric," she said firmly. "I choose to protect, not control. And I won't let you destroy everything the Guardians stand for." Cedric's expression darkened. "Then you've made your choice." He raised his hands, and the shadowy figures around him began to move, creeping toward Amara like living shadows. But she stood her ground, holding the heart of the veil high. It began to glow, its light cutting through the darkness. "Buddy!" Amara called. The loyal dog barked, leaping at one of the shadowy figures and dispelling it with a single touch. She knew she had to focus. Cedric was the key.as. The shadows closed in. Amara closed her eyes and concentrated on the heart of the veil. She could feel its warmth spreading through her, connecting her to the Guardians who had come before. She opened her eyes, and a burst of light erupted from the crystal, scattering the shadows and illuminating the entire chamber. Cedric shielded his eyes, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he drew a dark blade from his side, its edge crackling with a dark energy. "You won't stop me," he shouted, charging at her. Chapter 24, The Battle of Wills. Amara braced herself. She had been trained for this, but facing Cedric was unlike any opponent she'd ever encountered. His attacks were fierce, his movements precise and driven by a mix of rage and desperation. She parried his strikes with the heart of the veil, using its energy to counter his dark blade. Around them, the chamber shook with the force of their battle. The ground cracked, and stones began to fall from the ceiling. But Amara's focus was on Cedric. She knew that if she could break through to him, she might be able to end this without more bloodshed. "Cedric, you don't have to do this," she shouted between blows. "This isn't the way." "Enough," he roared, swinging his blade with all his might. Amara dodged and felt the blade slice past her, close enough to feel the dark energy radiating off it. She knew she needed to end this quickly. Gathering all her strength, she focused on the heart of the veil, channeling its power through her body. A brilliant light enveloped her, and she thrust her hand forward, sending a wave of energy toward Cedric. It struck him square in the chest, knocking him back against the altar. His blade fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Cedric struggled to his feet, his face pale and exhausted. You think you've won?" he spat. "This is just the beginning." But Amara saw the truth in his eyes. He was defeated, his power drained. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, lowering the heart of the veil. "It doesn't have to be like this, Cedric. You can still come back to the light." Cedric looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and regret. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I can't go back. Not after everything I've done." Amara extended her hand. "It's never too late to make things right." For a moment, Cedric hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. But before he could take it, a shadowy figure appeared behind him, whispering something in his ear. His eyes widened, and he pulled back, a look of horror crossing his face. "No. Get away from me," he shouted, and with a flash of dark energy, he vanished, leaving only a cold breeze in his wake. Chapter 25, The Aftermath. The room was silent once more. The remaining shadows dissipated, and the chamber's eerie glow faded. Mr. Hawthorne, Helena, and Tobias finally reached Amara, their faces filled with relief and concern. "Are you all right?" Mr. Hawthorne asked, rushing to her side. Amara nodded, though she felt exhausted. "Cedric got away, but I don't think he'll be back anytime soon." Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the entrance, her eyes scanning the room. "You've done well, Amara," she said with a proud smile. "You've shown more courage and wisdom than many seasoned guardians. But this isn't over. Cedric will return, and we must be ready." Amara looked around at her fellow guardians, her new family. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but she also knew she wasn't alone. She had found her place, her purpose, and she was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 26, The Dawn of a New Era. Back at Whitfield Mansion, the Guardians began preparations for what they now called the New Dawn. They knew Cedric's escape meant he would be plotting his next move, but they also knew they had a powerful ally in Amara and the Heart of the Veil. Amara continued her training, delving deeper into the ancient texts and honing her abilities. She knew the journey ahead would be long and filled with uncertainty, but she felt more ready than ever. She had grown from the scared little girl who found a lost dog into a guardian of the Veil, standing strong against the darkness. Buddy remained her faithful companion, always at her side, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they stood at the edge of a new adventure, the light of the Heart of the Veil guiding their way. Chapter 27, The Whisper of Shadows. The Guardians were on high alert after the battle at Whitfield Mansion. The mansion itself had been damaged in the skirmish. Broken windows and cracked walls served as a constant reminder of the dark forces that had breached their sanctuary. Repair efforts were underway, but the tension among the Guardians was palpable. Everyone knew that Cedric Hawthorne's retreat was only temporary. Amara, still carrying the weight of her recent victory and the expectations that came with it, had become a central figure among the Guardians. She continued to train daily, honing her abilities and deepening her understanding of the artifacts and ancient knowledge of the Veil. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something beyond the walls of Whitfield Mansion. One night, while practicing in the Grand Library, Amara heard a faint whisper. She turned, but no one was there. The library was silent, save for the crackling of a nearby fireplace. Buddy, lying beside her, perked up his ears and growled softly. "Did you hear that, Buddy?" Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Buddy barked softly in response, confirming her suspicions. The whisper grew louder, turning into distinct words, though still faint. It seemed to come from all directions at once. "Seek the Well of Shadows. Seek the well." The words sent a chill down Amara's spine. She knew the Guardians had many secrets, but she had never heard of the Well of Shadows. She decided to consult Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne the next morning. Chapter 28, The Well of Shadows. The next day, Amara found Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Hawthorne in the council chamber. She described the whispers she had heard and the ominous mention of the Well of Shadows. Mrs. Whitfield's face darkened. "The Well of Shadows is a forbidden place, one that hasn't been spoken of in years," she explained. "It's said to be a realm where the boundaries between our world and the realm of darkness are thin, where shadows take form and light is devoured." Mr. Hawthorne added, "It's a place where Cedric may very well seek refuge. If he has managed to gain access to the well, his powers could be amplifying beyond our comprehension." Amara listened intently. "If it's so dangerous, why haven't we tried to seal it off?" "Because it's not a place easily found or closed," Mrs. Whitfield replied. "It moves, like a shadow in the night, appearing only when it chooses to. And entering it requires a guide, someone who knows the path." A heavy silence filled the room. The implications were clear. If Cedric had found his way into the Well of Shadows, they would need to go after him. And given Amara's growing connection to the Veil, she might be their best chance of navigating such a dangerous place. Chapter 29, A Dangerous Plan. A council meeting was called. All the senior guardians were present, their faces grim with the weight of what was being discussed. They debated the risks of entering the Well of Shadows, the potential losses, and what it could mean for the future of the Guardians. Helena, the master of defensive spells, spoke up. "We cannot let Cedric grow stronger. If he's in the well, he's likely gathering power and allies. We must act swiftly." Tobias, known for his ability to see through illusions, nodded. But we also can't go in blindly. We need a strategy, and we need to understand what we're facing. After hours of deliberation, it was decided. Amara, along with a small group of experienced guardians, would venture to the Well of Shadows. The group would include Mr. Hawthorne, Helena, Tobias, and a young guardian named Amon, known for his knowledge of ancient languages and traps. Amara felt a mix of fear and excitement. She knew the risks, but she also knew that if they didn't act, the darkness could grow beyond their control. Chapter 30, Into the Unknown. The journey to find the Well of Shadows began the next morning. Guided by a map pieced together from ancient texts and Amara's intuition, the group set out. The terrain was even more treacherous than the path to the lost sanctuary. The landscape seemed to shift and change around them, as if the very world resisted their passage. On the second night, they camped beside a cold, dark river. The air was thick with tension, and the guardians took turns keeping watch. During her watch, Amara felt a strange pull, a whisper in the wind that seemed to call her name. She stood up, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond their campfire's light. Amara, the voice whispered again. It was the same voice from the library. She followed the voice, moving slowly so as not to wake the others. Buddy followed close behind, his hackles raised. The voice led her to the river's edge, where she saw a faint, glowing light beneath the water's surface. She knelt down, peering into the depths, and saw a reflection of herself, but not as she was. The reflection showed her dressed in dark robes, her eyes glowing with a strange light. She felt a wave of fear and pulled back. This is a warning, she whispered to herself. The well is near. She returned to camp, her heart heavy with the realization that they were drawing closer to their destination. Chapter 31, The Threshold. On the fourth day, they reached a clearing where the land seemed to dip downward, forming a natural crater. At the center of the crater was a stone archway, partially covered in vines and moss. The air around it was colder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. That's it, Mr. Hawthorne said quietly. The entrance to the Well of Shadows. As they approached, Amara felt a strange pressure in her chest, like a heavy weight pressing down on her. She could see the shadows around the archway shifting and moving as if they were alive. Remember, Helena said, stay close together. The well will try to separate us, but we must stay strong. Once inside, we need to move quickly and find Cedric before he realizes we're there. Amara nodded, clutching the heart of the veil tightly in her hand. She stepped forward with the others, passing through the stone archway. A cold wind blew past them, and she felt a sudden sense of vertigo. The world around them seemed to twist and bend, the colors fading into shades of gray and black. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse like a living being. We're in, Tobias whispered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. The Well of Shadows. Chapter 32, The Shadow Beasts. The air was thick with a dark mist that seemed to cling to their skin. The path ahead was obscured, and the shadows moved like living creatures, flickering and stretching unnaturally. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder. As they moved deeper into the well, strange sounds echoed around them, whispers, growls, and distant wails. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. She could sense something watching them, something not quite human. Suddenly, they heard a low, rumbling growl. The group stopped, forming a defensive circle. From the shadows, a pair of glowing red eyes emerged, followed by another, and another. Shadowy beasts with elongated limbs and sharp, glistening teeth prowled around them, stalking their every move. Hold your ground. Helena commanded, raising her hands and casting a protective barrier around the group. The beasts lunged, and the guardians fought back, using both spells and weapons to fend them off. Amara focused the power of the heart of the veil, sending out bursts of light that caused the beasts to recoil. Buddy barked and snapped at their heels, helping drive them back. The battle was fierce, but the guardians managed to hold their ground. When the last beast was defeated, the shadows seemed to recede, and the group took a moment to catch their breath. They're getting stronger, Tobias said, panting. The deeper we go, the more dangerous this place becomes. Amara nodded, her grip tightening on the heart. We have to keep moving. Cedric is waiting.